My name is Brandon Vaught. I'm the District Conservationist for Natural Resources Conservation Service out of Sheridan County, North Dakota. What I'm here to talk to you about today is how to do soil texturing and how to identify horizons in a soil head-on, or otherwise the horizon or the soil profile. So that's what I would like to start with, is the texturing, so we kind of get the basis of how that works. So by now I'm sure most students have an idea, if they've been through an agricultural class or anything like that, they'll have an idea of what soil is made of. We're talking about sand, silt, and clay as the three main particles. And every soil is kind of comprised of different percentages of each of those particles. And how that ends up playing out in a soil profile will kind of determine on how it behaves for either construction purposes, planting crops, or just managing water in general. What we are in today is a pasture, so a lot of these soils are kind of on the poorer end of things compared to what you would find in a crop field, and that's kind of why it's still pasture. But so basically, for texturing, what we're trying to do is classify what end of the spectrum we are as far as what percentage of sand, silt, and clay are in this ground. And how we do that is we take a little bit of soil and crumble it up as much as you can, like this. Pull out your roots as much as you can. So if it looks about like that, you should be okay. And for the person that's doing this, always use your not writing hand, because you'll get mud all over your paper when you try to write notes. You basically want to wet it down enough to where it'll hold a nice ball. Like about like this. So if it holds a nice form like this, you got the moisture about right. If it looks like pancake batter still, it's too wet, grab some more soil and add it in there to dry it out. If it doesn't form a ball, you don't have enough water. Or it's sandy, like actual beach sand. So then there's a process that we go through, asking yourself certain questions to determine the texture. You start by getting into a ball, so now we know there's at least a little bit of silt or clay in this. It's not completely sand. So then the next step is to form a ribbon. And how you do that is you take your thumb in the middle of your pointer finger and just kind of press it out, make a ribbon like this. Now, depending on how long this ribbon ends up being, that'll throw us into certain texture classes. So if it's really short, so less than 1 inch ribbon, we're in a sandy texture class. If it's about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, we're in a loamy texture class. And if it's greater than 1.5 inches, then we're in a clayey texture class. Okay? And this will take practice. I've been doing this for almost 10 years, so I can get a pretty good ribbon out of a lot of things. But so this is about 1 inch, so we're right there at a loamy. So that means there's pretty close to equal amounts of sand, silt, and clay in this soil profile. Loamy is a pretty good soil to have for any kind of management, because it's right in the middle. It's not extreme one way or the other as far as management purposes. The next thing we do is we figure out how much coarse fragments there are in, or any coarseness to the soil. We over wet it. So now we want to make it like a puddle in your hand. And rub your finger around in your hand, and if you feel it overly gritty, then we're in a sandy loam texture class. If it feels really smooth, then we're on the clay side of things. If it doesn't really feel excessively one way or the other, it's a loam. Okay, that's kind of texturing in a nutshell. So I'll do it a couple more times here with the clay sample, or Beth will.
This is just an example of what a soil with more clay would ribbon like. So you can tell already it's very sticky on my hands. That's one indicator, but again, we made our little ball, push it between your fingers, and with a heavy clay soil, we're gonna get a ribbon that's gonna go for days. See, that one is much longer than the one that Brandon had before with the loam.
Okay. And yeah, I would encourage you to just get out and with your students, go outside, just dig a hole and just practice texturing. That's how you get good at it, because it's a thing by feel, and you have to get experience to know kind of what the question is asking you. So moving on, we'll talk about how to identify horizons a little bit. And I have 3 different examples here of different soils on different points in the landscape, and I'll kind of try to explain to you why that makes a difference. So we're on the shoulder edge of a hill here, and on this head-on that I dug up. Those are generally our more shallow sites, and what I mean by that is the topsoil is quite thin until we get to either a restrictive layer or what would act as a bedrock. In North Dakota, we don't always have solid bedrock. Some of it is actually, it looks just like soil, but it's not. In this case, you want to zoom in out. We have a very shallow topsoil. So the first few inches, I guess I should explain we classify horizons. There's a few things we look at. First thing is color, generally, is how you can separate horizons. Second thing will be structure. And then a third option would be if certain chemical characteristics that we can identify in the field. Most of the time, I go through this and I'll pick out where my color differences are. So in this particular one, if you can see it on the camera, we don't really have a color change, a drastic color change, until we get about 6 inches deep, and it's not really that big of a color change to an untrained eye, but there is a slight color change there. And then obviously once we get closer to the bottom, we get a really defined line. The thing we're looking at is the color, really, is to determine where about our A and B and C, and those are our base horizons that we would talk about. A is always on the top, B is in the middle, C is on the bottom. Pretty simple stuff. And then we further segregate it into when we look at the different structure that happens throughout the profile. And then we can also go into the texture, if there's texture changes throughout the profile. When I'm talking structure, I'm talking about the shape of the aggregates in the soil. Okay, and most of that, it's either formed by, it has a few different influences, the kind of plants that we have on the soil surface, and the kind of texture. They're kind of bigger ones. Generally what you'll find on the top end is a granular structure. That's because usually we have a whole bunch of roots on the top end, and that's what helps us form that. So it's lots of pore space on the top end. And then we move further down the line on this one, we kind of get into a prismatic. And what we call that name, so once you get down below this granular structure here, it kind of comes into these columns here. And that's generally an indicator we've got some clay in the soil that it holds together pretty nicely and causes that. You can also get, if you have a lot of salts in the soil, it kind of gets a biscuit top. We don't have that example here today. So that would be where I would start. My B horizon would be right at the top of this, where this prismatic or this structure change happens. And then when we change again is when we get to this band of kind of lighter soil and lighter colored soil and a bunch of gravel chunks in here. That's where I would start my C horizon. And the chalky look to it, you see in North Dakota, it generally means that there's very high in carbonates. Our soils are derived from glacial deposits, as well as what's underneath that glacial deposit is an old seabed. So there's a lot of deposits of calcium from the seabeds, as well as breakdown of the parent material that was deposited by glacial deposition. But I mean, you can obviously see carbonates if it's really chalky and white, but we can also have carbonates farther up in the profile. And the way we determine that is a dilute solution of hydrochloric acid. And what that does is it reacts with the carbonates, and depending on how much carbonates are in there, you'll have a certain degree of reaction of bubbling. So if there's a lot of bubbles, there's a lot of carbonates. If there's no bubbles, there's no carbonates. So as you can see, there is very intense reaction as far as this goes, and then it just stops. Okay. Why that matters is the carbonates can restrict the plant's ability to absorb water. Ergo, we affect what plants can actually survive on this kind of soil, or what crops we could potentially grow. This kind of soil will not grow very many annual crops. Okay. Another example, we only moved about 20 yards down the hill slope. So now we're in what would be called a toe position, or in this particular we're just in a swale between two hills. But what happens is when we get rainfall, or even if the soil is bare, we have energy moving downhill. Therefore we have usually a lot darker, deeper soils at the toe slope than I would on the shoulder slope. Generally, if you're familiar with what these landscape positions are, if you look in a pasture or even in a crop field, they're generally your higher producing areas because a lot of the water ends up here. A lot of our more productive topsoil has ended up here over time. That's why if you look at this profile, it's quite a bit different because we have a lot deeper, darker color here than we did up there, and it goes a lot deeper in the profile than up on the hill. I dug this hole as far as my tools would allow me, which was about 6 feet, and I still didn't find the bottom of it. So this is very deep soil. When we look at the structure, here we have a little bit more granular structure than we did up there. And we do have that prismatic look to it again before we jump into a B horizon here. And there may be more than one B horizon, depending on if we're looking at different structure changes, but we haven't lost enough color to call it a C. And that's kind of what this is. There's a couple different B horizons going on here. One starts at about, about 6 inches is where we start with our B horizon, because we have a structure change here. And then I would call this one the start of a second B horizon, because we have a little bit of a structure change, but also a slight color change. Just to a lighter brown color. Some soils it's pretty cut and dry. There's A, B, and C, and that's it. Others there could be more than, up to 7 or 8 different horizons, and it depends on how it was formed and how long it took to form it. As far as carbonates go and texturing go, this soil is a similar texture to the one up on the hill. It's going to be a lot similar as far as loaminess, but there, just from the naked eye here, I can see there is a bit more sand in here, and that might throw it into a different texture class. Do you have that poster with the triangle up the hill? But even looking at this one, I did get a little bit too much water in here, but you can already kind of tell, compared to what was up there, this one has a little more sand in it because it doesn't hold as tight of a ball. It does form a ball, so there is some presence of silt and clay in it, so it's not complete sand. Might add a little more to it. and we do our ribbon. So this one is less than an inch. So then we would classify this instead of a sandy loam, it is a loamy sand. And that's just a simple difference in the amount of sand present. But it affects how the soil will hold on to water, and affects what kind of plants are going to survive down here. Now, see if I can get a good texture off of this. Since this has a little more silt or clay in it, it should ribbon a little more. And this is kind of trying to illustrate why the structure changed. Maybe. Okay. And the ribbon, still about the same. I might have it a little wet yet, but yeah. In a field setting, we would have to texture almost every horizon if it was drastic difference or noticeable differences. With my degree of background in soil science, I could have a multitude of jobs, but generally a soil scientist is one that's going to be out in the field describing things like this and putting in that information that goes into the web soil survey that you were seeing before. So these kind of skills are necessary for making those interpretations, and this kind of data isn't necessary for those interpretations. Okay, we can move to the next spot. This hole is at the very bottom of the hill, and it's in what would be called a closed depression. Basically, it's a pothole. A place that holds water, and we can see how that affects the soil when we dig these up. Generally, these places that hold a lot of water have a lot more clay present in the profile. It doesn't have to necessarily be classified a clay soil though. And we can tell that it has some clay in it just by looking at the structure in comparison to what was up there a little further. You notice this has got more angles to it, a little more blocky towards the top, and it kind of breaks off in little plates. Okay, that's kind of indicators that there is presence of clay. This one also has a little presence of salt, and I can tell that just because it has this rounded top to it. That's kind of sort of an indicator of a presence of salts. Not always a management issue until you see white crust on the surface and plants are not making it. The other thing that you'll notice in a soil that has been in water for a long time is little, what we call redox models. And it might be hard to see on the camera, but you'll notice little orange modules all over the soil profile to wherever the water came up. And the reason that happens is it's oxidizing the iron that is in the soil profile, and it's just like the rusting metal is essentially what it is. But it is an indicator that this soil has a high water table or does hold water for periods of time. Yeah, I will go ahead and texture this one, and maybe the ribbon will be a little bit bigger. But on this soil, while I'm getting this ready, where I would draw my lines for horizons on this one, you notice that the color really is almost the same all the way through. This has gotten dried out, so it'll really look different once things dry out, but looking at the wet color, you have a color change start at the top of this kind of more blocky structure here. It's blocky, almost prismatic, and similar to what was up on the hill there. But right here's where I would draw my A horizon, and then I would probably draw my B. We haven't found a C yet on this site, so there's a couple B's here before we get down to a C. I'm limited by the tools I have today to get all the way down. Generally, when we're looking at a soil profile, we're looking at about 5 feet of the face of a hole. Yeah, we do have changing colors about here and here. And then the other thing that I would draw my horizons for is the structure definitely changes from a very granular to a blocky right here. And then it kind of keeps with that blocky, but the blocks get a little bit larger the further down we go. Yeah, just trying to illustrate that every soil is going to, there's some of them that are quite easy to tell where the changes happen, and there's others that are not nearly as easy. So generally for the test though, we do have a head-on that's similar to the one on the top of the hill, so it's not quite as challenging. And then we'll texture this one. Maybe. Yeah, we're still in that loam. We're about an inch, a little less than an inch. But even here we can tell there is presence of clay just because of how the structure changed and the shape of the structure. We get these plates. So I don't know, do you have anything to add?
No, that sounds good to me.
Do you want to explain that one?
Yeah, I guess another tool that we use sometimes when working with textures, you're not going to get very precise as far as numbers out in the field, but you can do a method called the hydrometer method back in the lab, and it'll break out your sands, your silts, and your clays and give you an exact number on the percentages of sand, silt, and clay in your soil. And so we put this into a handy dandy little triangle, called this the soil textural triangle. We have percent clay on this side, we have percent silt on this side, and percent sand on this side. And so basically, if you know the percentages of each sand, silt, and clay in your soil, you can identify what texture it is by matching up those numbers. And I could see them easily doing this at the state or the regional competition. Say we have a 30% sand soil with, I don't know, say 70% clay. So, and then we have the silt too. I'm just trying to go off my cuff of my hand. Okay, so we go to 30% sand. We follow that line up to match up with that 70% clay. And let's say it's easier if it's not upside down. Okay, 30% sand. We'll say maybe 30% clay. So we go clay over, sand over, and then that would give us 40% silt, and that's going to put us into that clay loam, if that makes sense. And you can do that with any number. We could try again and say we have a 60% sand and a 10% clay. So we go to 60% on the sand side, we intercept it with the clay line, which would be 10% here, and then that would make us have a 30% silt and would put us in the sandy loam category. So I could see them easily using that in the competition, and it just helps you to further understand that all soils are made up of certain percentages of sand, silt, and clay, and it can be illustrated out into this handy dandy textural triangle.
All right, any final thoughts?
Just that we took 3 different samples in a very short span of distance, and all 3 soils looked a little bit different, so that just goes to show you the different soils that we have out here in the landscape.